There's always a kind of conversation the week before Parashat Behukkotai. This is true also with Parashat Kitzavo, of who's going to get the aliyah for the curses. It's not considered a thing that someone wants, and you don't want to give the aliyah for curses to anyone in particular, because then it would assume that they're deserving of the curses, and therefore usually one of us takes it, one of the rabbis. I have the lucky draw this Shabbat to take the aliyah of the curses. There's actually a dispute about whether it's considered not a good thing or a good thing. Some people say any aliyah to the Torah is a good thing, and so we should just distribute it as any, but our practice has been to be a little wary of it. Also, there's an interesting practice around the reading that the section of the curses, which is called the tochacha, or the rebuke, has to be preceded by at least another verse in order that we don't bless on calamity. That we will not give a blessing, say the aliyah, on a calamity. And so the Torah, the structure of the reading is designed in order that no one make a blessing on a calamity, either at the beginning of the aliyah or at the end. So it's the curses, the tochacha, are bookended really by another verse in order that no one be making a blessing on a calamity. We have a very full Shabbat with many smachot, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing. So I just want to focus a little bit on the practices of what happens in the tochacha, because it's actually fairly interesting, and there are choices that different communities make and different minhagim, customs, and I think they speak to kind of the challenge and the interest in our tradition to kind of wrestle with this portion. There are of course blessings in this parasha, but they pale in comparison to the curses, of which are much more lengthy and quite horrifying, actually. And I am not here to stand up here to make a case for the theology that is expressed in this parasha, but I think in some ways the minhagim, the customs around the tochacha, are trying to wrestle with that very idea. What does it mean to have a section of blessings and curses, more curses, in this parasha, and how should we deal with it? So I'm not here to speak to the way great many theologians have wrestled with this kind of theology of reward and punishment over the thousands of years of our history. But I do want to practice on the differing customs when it comes to the tochacha, the rebuke. Ashkenazim, which is the practice of our community, even though we have a very diverse community in terms of Sephardim and Ashkenazim, have the custom of reading the curses in an undertone. Lizzie, for years, has read the curses in an undertone and sometimes quickly. This has been our practice in general. And the reason given for such a practice is that we should be ashamed or embarrassed and humiliated by the ways we have sinned and failed. It's kind of an expression of the encounter that the world is filled with so much pain and so much terror and so much sin, and that our expression of that is taking in some way some responsibility for it and kind of living in the undertone of the feeling and the experience of knowing the truth of that. And so we say the reading with some acknowledgement of that the reality of the curses is alive in our world, and it's a mum, it's a blemish on us, and therefore we speak to that by saying the curses in an undertone, and therefore they're said quietly in some way to acknowledge the devastation and the shame that results with straying from God's path. Because of course, if we followed God's path, says the parasha, we would receive blessing. Another reason, some people actually have the practice not only of chanting them quietly, but chanting them in a mournful tone, somewhat like the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations, and slowly and quietly to express, of course, our sorrow in the reality of curses being alive and well in our world. Still, another reason given for the chanting of the verses quietly is to gently ease people in to accept the fact that if they don't do the work of God,
and they stray from God's path, then they will awaken more, rather than in a harsh tone. It's kind of a pedagogical question. How do you ease someone into understanding something rather than yelling at someone? You want to gently say. The power of the words is actually saying it quietly. I remember very distinctly once I had a parent that was very upset with me, and I was expecting a scream, and instead of a scream, I got a quiet rebuke, which was more devastating than any other rebuke that I could have received. And in some way, I think that's the expression of speaking the curses quietly, is to gently tell us this is really serious, which makes us more attentive to listening. We have to be alive to the listening. And interestingly enough, over time, we, in our community, have used the notion of speaking verses quietly to acknowledge the harm of a text. That in modern times, or you could say we're in postmodern times, people speak verses from the Torah quietly to acknowledge that these verses cause harm, that the notion of having a punishing God and the pain that is generated by that, and that people are deserving of curses, causes harm, and that religious life based on that idea of punishment and reward actually hasn't served religion well in certain ways. And so some people chant verses quietly to acknowledge that fact. So the quietness of the Ashkenazic tradition in speaking these verses is many ways an acknowledgement of the truth, which is that the world is filled with curses. And we don't have to imagine that, because we read the paper every day, and we are experiencing a deep reality of the curses of the world in our time. The harshness that exists in the Torah is just as harsh and what's alive in the world today. And so the goal of reading the curses in that tone is to awaken us towards that truth and to arouse us towards tshuva, to beckon towards the right path, and to acknowledge in many ways how much pain exists not only in the text, but in our world. Sephardim have the practice actually of speaking the curses out loud with no undertone or quiet. And there are some commentators actually that abhor the practice of reading the curses quietly. The Chafetz Chaim, who's not Sephardic, he's a Lithuanian rabbi, is amongst them. And he says the following: there are communities where the Tochacha is read in so low a voice that many people cannot hear the words. Some people even leave the synagogue rather than hearing the dire warnings in these verses. We're paying attention who's walking out the door during the curses. And he asked, to what can someone compare such behavior? To a man who was warned not to walk through a certain path because it was filled with thorns and dangerous obstacles. The person, though, did not heed the warnings and decided to walk the path. The only precaution that the person took was to blindfold himself so that he would not see the various dangers. Of course, by doing so, he simply made the trip more dangerous. By the same token, says the Chafetz Chaim, there are those who believe that if we do not hear the Tochacha, nothing bad will happen. They do not realize that it is meant to arouse people to perform the commandments, and if one does not listen to it being read, it compounds the danger. So this orientation of the reading the Tochacha out loud is for a couple of reasons. It's cautionary, right? As opposed to a quiet reading, which is kind of in many ways acknowledging the truth of the universe and the world, the speaking the curses in a loud voice is to awaken fear, to say, don't go down that path, don't stray from God, and also don't deny that truth, that there is impact in actually going down the wrong path, and we shouldn't look away as if there's no impact. And even if we don't believe theologically that God is going to punish us for making certain choices, there are many notions, particularly the Rambam, who talks about that the world is if we do something good, it tips it in the good direction. If we do something bad, sinful, it tips it in a harsher direction, and that we in some way have the power and agency to make a difference in that way, and we shouldn't deny that truth. And so speaking the curses out loud is some acknowledgement and to awaken the fear to say, actually our actions matter and we should do our best to stay on the path of God. This year, as I said, it feels like the curses are more descriptive than prescriptive. Our world is so torn apart and filled with violence and pain. And I would never assert theologically that God is responsible for such curses. And in fact, it's quite difficult to affirm a theology of reward and punishment in such a world when our experience doesn't prove that to be true. Plenty of people who make good choices are not rewarded, and plenty of people who do such evil are not punished. We live with so much mystery and so much uncertainty. We live with calamity and blessing and curse and fear and gratitude. And the truth is, we live with no guarantees. And I think we all know that, which is kind of the most fearful aspect about living, is that there are no guarantees. And so our tradition creates these minhagim in many ways to awaken us to something that says, I think the minhagim, the customs, are meant to say, not what is God going to do, really, ultimately, but what are we going to do? What is our response in a quiet reading of the curses that is supposed to acknowledge our responsibility in this, and how, in saying the reading out loud in a full voice, might we get a little more fearful about making good choice in the world? The various customs are meant to attune us to how to respond to a world that is filled with such curses. There isn't one way, but all of the responses put a deep amount, of responsibility in our hands to own our portion in the world of walking on the right path. And the famous Heschel saying, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, morally speaking, there is no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings. Indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. And in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And in many ways, all the minhagim, all the customs of the reading of the curses are meant to awaken the notion that all are responsible, including me. There are some other customs associated with the curses that I think are particularly powerful. There's a tradition, I didn't ask Ari to do this, and actually I'll be saying the Misha Berach, that the Chazan, when reciting a Misha Berach, the prayer for healing, concludes this blessing with the words, may God change the curses into blessings, and may it thus be God's will, and let us say amen. Which is just to say that besides awakening us to the reality of what it means to take responsibility, there is also the hope and the prayer for transformation. That sometimes we learn in the worst of circumstances, in the greatest of curses, what we want and what we can transform the world to be, and to not leave the curses only as curses, but our power to make change and transform. And finally, there's an interesting dialogue in the Gemara in Megillah that says that the curses, it says, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said, Ezra enacted for the Jewish people that they should read the portion of the curses that are in Leviticus and Vayikra, which is what we read today, before Shavuot. Shavuot is not this coming week, but the week after. Shavuot always falls after Bamidbar, the first parasha in the book of Numbers. And it says this, so therefore, Behukkotai is always read within a week or two of Shavuot. And the Kitavo, the curses in Deuteronomy, are always read before Rosh Hashanah. And it says, the Gemara asks, what is the reason for this? Why is it such that the curses are read at these very awesome moments of the year? One right before Shavuot and receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai, and the other at the beginning of the year for Rosh Hashanah. And the answer given is in order that we may conclude the year together with its curses, and the new year may begin without the ominous reading of the curses. So as we mark this time of the reading of the curses,
Again, I think in many ways the question, are they descriptive, are they prescriptive? I think they're both. And the customs are supposed to enliven us to that truth and awaken us to our own responsibility in not desisting. And also, I think there are many in the world who are kind of leaning towards nihilism, like that we live in the world where nothing matters because some things are so hard. And I think part of the purpose of reading the Tochacha is actually to awaken us to say that's not true. Things matter, our actions matter, our feelings matter, our desire to transform the world from curses to blessings matter, and our customs should elevate that truth, and I think they do. So may it be that we conclude the verses right before Shavuot, that the hostages are returned, that there is an end to the endless violence in this war, and that we receive the Torah on Shavuot in a week and a half only with blessing. Amen.